The GLOBE program is going to feature strongly in our presentation today. And of course, that's Mike, I'm sure, making it happen. Thank you, Mike. Mike is our friend behind the scenes. Thank you for everything you're doing. All right, well, with that, I want to introduce to you our speakers today who have agreed to come forward. And also thank you to Genevieve, who made the connection for us to the speakers so that we could learn from them and share in their wisdom and knowledge. So let me introduce them both. They are both members of the Chickasaw Nation and both live in Oklahoma. April Taylor, who's going to be the first speaker, is a tribal liaison with the Chickasaw Nation, officed at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center in Norman, Oklahoma. Her position includes facilitating relationships between the 68 tribes and climate scientists in Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. As a Chickasaw citizen with a family tradition of Native American grafted pecan trees, which I would love to hear about, she is inspired by helping the tribes manage and plan for the many environmental impacts of climate variability and change. Thank you for your beautiful work, April. Following her, and in collaboration together, Amelia Cook will be presenting. And Amelia is a science teacher at Norman High School in Norman, Oklahoma. She co-sponsors their school district's Native Youth Science Club in collaboration with the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, where April works. Their club promotes Indigenous science knowledge through Native American storytelling and science education for students in elementary, middle, and high school. And together they're going to tell us about a joint project that they initiated with the kids, again, centering the globe citizen science world, which is huge, I think. So very excited to see this one window into GLOBE through your eyes and through the eyes of the children. And again, it's centered on the mosquito mapping part of it. So very apropos, Juan Carlos, thank you so much for finding that and making that resonance for us. All right, with that, please feel free to share your cameras or not. Please definitely mute your mics. We can do that in the background if something happens, don't worry about it. But over to you, April. And I think let's use the chat room for comments and we can collate questions and stuff in there. After the presentation, we will have discussion time. All right, take it away, April. And thank you again both for being here. Thanks to all of you for joining.
Great, thank you, Danielle, for that. So I'm going to share my screen. Does that look good? Yes.
It's perfect.
Great. So we're going to be talking about how we have been using the NASA GLOBE monitoring app and activity today as our focus. So let's see. So she already introduced ourselves, so I'll just go on with that. So today I'll be sharing with you how we've been using the NASA GLOBE mosquito app for tribal health professionals. And then I'll switch it over to Amelia and she will share a specific outreach event that we've been doing with the Jones Academy STEAM Camp, which is a boarding school here in Oklahoma. And then she'll talk about briefly about our Native Youth Science Club here in Norman. Oops, wrong way. So first of all, I wanted to share with you all a little bit about the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center where I work. So I am a tribal liaison at the center, and our region, which I'll show a map here, is New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. So we have about 68 federally recognized tribes in our region and many more non and state recognized tribes as well that we work with. Our center was established in 2012, so almost 9 years now, right at 9 years. And our center focuses on providing natural and cultural resources with the science, tools, and information to address climate impacts and variability and change. And the way I explain it is we're half consortium and half USGS. And so our consortium is shown here in the map. We're unique in that we're the only CASC, Climate Adaptation Science Center, that has tribal nations at our consortium level. So we have Chickasaw Nation and Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And then we have several universities as well, and we're hosted here in Norman, Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma. So as I mentioned, yeah, we're the we have several universities and then the tribes. And typically we would have a New Mexico tribal liaison as well, and we'll be hiring here in a few months to get me some help again. So our tribal engagement strategy, as this diagram sort of shows, is over time and with increasing involvement, we ultimately aim to, that the tribes are developing their own climate adaptation plans and integrating climate into their various plans, such as emergency management plans or forestry plans or whatever that may be. But we really view our tribal youth as one of the key aspects of our plan, of our engagement. And the way I explain that is we view that as really important, that the youth are going to be the next generation that are really going to be facing climate change in their lifetimes. And then currently in our region, we don't have tribal climate staff. And so that workforce development and generating the next generation of tribal staff to work in climate area change. So our program, our tribal engagement program, consists of 3 areas: workforce development, building capacity, and research. I'm going to talk first about the workforce development arm. So we do K through 12 education outreach, primarily informal education. We go out to festivals and after-school programs and summer camps and things like that. And we've developed quite the number of activities. We have a closet here that we just have filled up, and we add different activities to pretty regularly for us to take out and be in the communities and provide that STEM education. We partner with tribal colleges as well, and I'll share an example of that here in a minute. And then we host Native student interns. I have 6 right now, and we've had as many as 42 supported by our tribal engagement program in that 9 years. So a couple examples. So I know Caroline and John are on from NYCALC. And so the Native Youth Community Adaptation Leadership Congress is a large camp outside of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, that we've been doing for 5 or 6 years now. And it's a week to 10 days or something like that. But it's 100 Native high schoolers that we bring in from all across the country, including Alaska, Samoa, Hawaii, all over. And so the South Central, we've been on the planning team and have brought our junior faculty with us. And so it's one of the most inspiring things that we are involved in. And one of the avenues that we've been exposed to some of the NASA education outreach resources, such as the NASA Globe apps. And so I believe it's Dorian that comes and does some of those activities with us. And so it's one avenue that I've learned about the NASA Globe. As far as tribal colleges, one of the things that we did was a tribal college conference on climate adaptation. And so we've had definitely some really big Native speakers come in to those conferences that we have done. And we've brought in quite a few partners on those. And this is one thing that I really enjoyed doing and get asked about a lot. And when are we going to do those again? So, oops, I did it again. So I mentioned that we have the Native interns as well. And so an example of that is we get a BIA Pathways intern, 1 or 2 of those each summer. So one of them was Tyler Delmedico, and he worked on identifying river cane restoration sites within the Kiamichi River for the Choctaw Nation here in Oklahoma. And then he got to present a couple times on that as well. And he came to NICALC, and so the photo is our group from NICALC that 2 years ago. And so this aspect of my job was unexpected, but it's been one of the most rewarding and inspiring pieces of my job, because you get to see them grow up and go on to grad school, or it's in these pictures, graduate and get jobs and start their lives. And so it's definitely really cool time in their life. So now back to the 3 arms. So the second arm is the building capacity arm. And so I wanted to come back to that. So one of our trainings, our first training for tribal health professionals, was in December of 2019 here in Norman. And we partnered with the Southern Plains Tribal Health Center, or the Tribal Epidemiology Centers. We had 18 tribal attendees from 4 tribes and 216 contact hours for the 2 days. And we chose to do the NASA mosquito monitoring activity with the adults, with the tribal health professionals. We had a Chickasaw student, Jacob Nichols, who's standing there. He came to us from the Chickasaw STEM Academy, and they do a lot of robotics and working with curriculum and education for youth. And so he was a great asset to come in and help us with this activity. And so he purchased all the supplies, and then he developed our presentation for the training. And we worked with an Oklahoma NASA space grant funded researcher, Kyle Franca, at Southern Nazarene University. And so Kyle has been doing the Globe outreach here in Oklahoma, but he also is a researcher. So he has data and collects mosquito larvae and population data here in Oklahoma. And so he was a great asset and contribution to our training, and came in. And so it was really cool to see them interact and develop the activity for the group and teach it. So if you're not familiar with the NASA Globe, there are several different tools available. And so we focused on the Mosquito Habitat Mapper app as our primarily focus for this. And then you can use the window cover to look at as well. But basically, once you've got the app, you open it and answer the questions, and then you identify your larvae. It walks you through a series of questions to be able to identify what species you have, and then you review and upload that data. So you're collecting citizen science data for your area of interest, and contributing to researchers like Kyle and his work here in Oklahoma. And so it's really, you only need a pipette and a paper plate, and then your clip-on microscope for your phone or tablet device. And so it's fairly cheap. I think we spent $18 a piece on our microscopes. And so we have a set a whole set in order to do a training or a classroom and take out. And so you take photos with your microscope on your phone or your tablet device and upload the larvae into the Globe app. And so I think that's one of the most cool things, is that you get to see what the larvae look like, and it's quite challenging to learn how to take the photos and identify them and see them up close. And so here's a couple of photos of our training of them trying to take photos of their larvae and playing with it. And so, but overall, I wanted to sort of touch base on some of the discussion topics. And so we talked quite a bit with the tribal public health professionals about creating their own monitoring programs for vectors and helping contribute to the data. So whether it's mosquitoes or ticks or other types of vector-related types of data and monitoring and the need for that. And then we talked about, the need for tribal health data on these mosquito-borne diseases and what kinds of tribal health data is available or what would be needed to get better at this and things like that. And then we talked a lot about the need for research in that area as well. So research projects or possible access to those types of data and maybe opportunities to bring in Native students to work on those types of projects as well. We talked about the need to work across departments. So maybe with your environmental department that does water quality monitoring or something, or out there across the jurisdiction, the need to work with emergency managers as well in those response to potential outbreaks or and monitoring and notification of what's going on. As far as education, we talked about a lot about the need to educate our health departments and staff, and then also the need to educate our citizens especially in key seasons. And so creating public service announcements or communication avenues to do that. We also talked a little bit about, so in the training, we did a cluster analysis GIS activity with the participants. And I think we looked at heat data for that activity, but the need to do some kind of mapping and including GIS on some of these things in your monitoring. We talked a lot about funding. So the BIA Tribal Resilience Program has funding, and it's out right now if you're not familiar with that. There's also a youth category. So if you were interested in more on the youth outreach side as well. And then CDC has been offering tribal funding as well for things like this. And so there's been some tribes that have gotten funding for climate change and health. And then more of the typical grants that the tribal public health professionals are used to is NIH and NIEH, which is the environmental health funding. And so we had some good discussions about what types of things we could go after. And then we talked a little bit about other tribal climate health impacts. So whether it's heat-related illnesses and the need to monitor for that. Harmful algal blooms was another really interesting discussion. And so the need to work with tribal health professionals on those things. And then I just added in there that, so I was invited and I was offered a travel scholarship to go to the National Indian Health Conference. And unfortunately with COVID, that didn't end up happening, and now their focus is definitely on COVID right now. And so I chose not to go this year, but I am presenting at the Southern Plains Tribal Health Conference coming up on this effort, and my talk is on April 20th at 3 p.m. And so we're hoping to continue this discussion and interest in working with tribal health professionals and needs for training on these types of topics. And then these are just a few photos of our wonderful participants, and they got certificates. And so there's our group photo of our great group that attended our first training for that. And so I think that's my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing and then let Amelia take the reins. Oh, there it is. I had to close something to stop sharing. So Amelia, I think you're good to go.
All right. Thank you, April. Give me just 1 second to transition over and share my screen. Okay, and if you would please, would someone give me a thumbs up if everything looks good to go? Wonderful. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited to share kind of our work and what we've been working on with you. I'm going to explain a little bit this afternoon about how we took this super cool mosquito monitoring activity to this virtual setting. For Jones Academy, which is a Native American boarding school here in Oklahoma, every summer they have a STEAM camp. So STEAM, if you take STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and you add art to it, you have STEAM, and which I think is really cool for this program to bring in that cultural aspect and to really bring in that art. Art is very important and really elevates science communication. And so I was really excited to be a part of this program. So, Mosquito Monitoring Virtual STEAM Camp 2020. So how did we accomplish this? Adapt and overcome. So that's kind of the logo. That's the theme, you should say, for teaching this year. It's been a difficult year for teachers and students alike. But there were several challenges, as you can imagine. Camper disappointment was pretty high. Their camp that they look forward to every year became a virtual camp. This was following a semester of emergency learning where, it was the longest spring break in recorded history. So kids had a lot of Zoom fatigue. We had Zoom fatigue. So we were really concerned about this challenge of how do we bring this concrete science experiment experience to a virtual setting. So how do we get kids at home to be able to participate in a concrete science experiment? And then how do we make that culturally relevant during this crazy pandemic? So, summer camp is changing for them. It's going to be virtual. How are we going to meet these challenges? These challenges provided a tremendous amount of opportunities. And one of which being is between the collaboration between the Choctaw Nation, the Climate Center, and April and myself, we were able to adapt this mosquito monitoring activity to send it to the students. We actually send students cell phone microscopes. So each individual camper got their own individual cell phone microscope, and we sent them mosquito larvae specimens. So they were preserved mosquito larvae that we sent to student homes so that they could, start engaging right away with science and this mosquito larva and kind of get primed for this activity that we're going to be doing virtually. This was a tremendous opportunity, as I said, to collaborate. We had several Zoom meetings where, we were figuring out logistics and supplies and our instructional sequence. And it ended up being April's team of OU student interns ended up being mentors for us and actually teaching this virtual workshop for us, and also got to interact with the campers. And it was a really great collaboration. We also had an opportunity to put a spotlight on tribal public health and why it was important, especially during this time of COVID. And then an opportunity to adapt what we do with science curriculum to accommodate a hands-on virtual experience. I think that being a science teacher and an educator, that concrete hands-on experience is really important. So I am going to share, let me just one second. I'm going to share a link to what you see on the screen was our pre-camp instructions that we sent to our campers. And this ended up being a really handy tool that I just shared a link to the Google Doc. And so click on that link, travel on over to that Google Doc, and I'll kind of explain to you what you're seeing as we go through this. So we split this up to in a couple of different sections, and this went out a couple of weeks before camp. And they got these instructions, this HyperDoc in email so that they could go ahead and set up their technology. We're going to be using all Google products, so we wanted to make sure everybody had a Google account. They were used to using their Google account, and they could go ahead and download the Globe app to their phone and get familiar with it. And so we didn't, waste that precious time doing technical support and making sure everybody was on the same page. We also had an opportunity for them to start messing with their microscopes. They were really excited about this. We wanted to make sure that they worked, that they knew how they worked. And then we also got them to start taking pictures and exploring their microscopic world. And we posted them on a website called Padlet, which is just a digital sharing platform where you can, kind of have digital bulletin boards and you can share your work. And we had them taking pictures of their microscopic world and posting it on Padlet so they can kind of be seeing each other's pictures and also getting familiar with Padlet, which is what we were going to use later on in our workshop, which I'll tell you about. The pre-camp instructions also, gave them instructions on how to handle the larvae safely. They were in preservation isopropyl alcohol and just a little information on what these crazy creatures were that we sent them. And then I used this opportunity to go ahead and start priming them to start thinking about STEM and Native culture. And there was a link to a TED Talk that was about protecting Lakota culture with STEM. And it was this really interesting grad student that was using his research with counterfeit technology to authenticate Native American artwork that you see like in galleries or at a gas station or something like that. And they were, he kind of used that example to incorporate how you can use STEM knowledge to protect Native culture, but how you can also use Native culture to communicate science knowledge. He talks a little bit about constellations and using Lakota stories to teach those constellations. So it was a short little video just to kind of get kids primed about thinking about Native STEM. And then part of our workshop is we were centering around this Native American Osage story about the buffalo bull and the cedar tree. And that was going to be the main component of our discussion. So we sent them a copy of that, had some this consideration prompt, if you will, to get them talking and thinking about how scientific knowledge is passed on to the next generation through storytelling. And then we engaged them with some art. So we just, there's a link down on number 6 of a PDF that was directly from this fantastic resource. It was a Michael Caduto book that was Keepers of the Earth. And he always has really great, a Native American story with associated environmental science activities and stuff with this. So this story came from that resource. And we gave them a copy of this medicine wheel and just told them to just engage in art, color it, make it yours, but start thinking about Native culture, STEM, and mosquitoes. Oh, let me switch back over. Okay, so our instructional sequence, it was really important that we made sure they stayed active. Again, Zoom fatigue, we didn't want kids sitting there for hours upon end. So we had kind of 3 main learning cycles. And we started off with our culture aspect and our storytelling and discussions, and we used breakout rooms. And then Jones Academy, in between our cycles, would have like an active physical break for students. So they had them getting up and going and, scavenger hunt in their house, and, kids got up and moved around, and then they would come back. And then we did our science portion. And that's when we did our mosquito monitoring and vector-borne diseases, and then another break. And then we kind of tied the two together, our culture and our science. And then we came together to kind of evaluate what we mean by tribal public health. And then ultimately, their objective for the camp was to create a public service announcement poster. So a little bit about that, you'll see on my screen here that we have two examples on the left of a tribal specific public service announcement. And the main objective for us for our camp portion was that we wanted the kids to make a product, to make a physical, tangible product that applied what they were doing with this mosquito activity and with this cultural STEAM component. And so their objective was to create a tribal-specific public service announcement, and we made it a poster challenge. So we had a rubric that there were different judges that scored their posters, and then of course it was a STEAM challenge, and there was lots of prizes and stuff. So the Choctaw Nation was able to provide prizes and kind of incentivize this challenge. There were three main communication tools that we used to assist this virtual communication. The main one was a student guide, which I'll share with you here in just a minute, and it's very, very similar to the pre-camp instructions that you're already looking at. This helped us organize our resources, and it literally was a guide for students so that if they got kicked off of Zoom or their internet went down, that they had one HyperDoc right there with all the links that they needed, and they could jump back and forth. We used a Google product called Jamboard, which I'll show you here in just a second, but it's an interactive whiteboard that really helped us facilitate discussions, and we use those in our breakout rooms with our OU student mentors. And then, of course, we used Padlet, which again was our digital sharing platform. And at the end of the workshop, when they made their PSA posters, they posted them on Padlet so that everybody could see them. And then so that our judges who were, in different geolocations could score them, and we could have, kind of our challenge, but still be virtual. Our culture component, we started off with Native American storytelling. The story we used was the Buffalo Bull and the Cedar Tree, which is an Osage story. And ultimately, it was about how the bull and the cedar tree gave openly of themselves so that the Osage people could live well. And there was, we spent some time discussing, symbology in Native American storytelling and how those symbols, whether it's the medicine wheel or the circle of life or the four different directions, how that can be used to communicate through art as well. And then using those kind of symbological components in Native art, how they could use that to promote tribal public health in their public service announcements. And then throughout, we had examples of PSAs that were tribal specific. Our science focus was, again, our mosquito monitoring. They were able to use microscopes. We talked about mosquito-borne diseases, and then we brought in that environmental science and that ecology bit to where it was, habitat mapping, and it was citizen science. So they learned how to identify the species of mosquito during our workshop, and then use that information to go out in their local environment and find out where that mosquito larva could be found. And then we tied up the workshop with a final discussion about COVID-19 and the disproportionate impacts to tribal communities and why it's important when you're communicating science, and specifically medical science, why it's important to keep that tribal perspective and use storytelling and the symbology and the art to not only promote, but kind of elevate your communication. Okay, so one more, I have another link that I'm going to share with you in chat. And again, this is a very similar document to what you've just seen, but it shows you kind of what I mean by student guide during our workshop. So in the chat, I added another link to another HyperDoc. Again, looks very similar to the pre-camp instructions, which was also important for the students, so they kind of were used to seeing this, this technology. But again, as I mentioned before, this was a super critical communication tool with virtual instructions. It had all of the links that you needed. We set up like a digital folder where it had all the files they were going to need that day, the instructions, resources. It just really organized everything they were going to use. So again, if they got lost or we broke out into discussion groups, they would have everything they needed right there in that one document. There was a link to the slide deck that we used that day. And again, if you're looking at the HyperDoc, those links should be clickable. So you can kind of click through those and just kind of engage with that document and see kind of what I mean about how it really guided the students' inquiry throughout this workshop. We also had our poster requirements on there. So the day that we had our workshop, the poster wasn't due until like the end of that week. So they had plenty of time to kind of work on it. But again, they had their HyperDoc that had their rubric and where they were going to share their products on Padlet. And then we also had, so number 4 is when we broke off into our discussion groups and what they were going to be discussing in their breakout rooms. We had the questions kind of right there. I know, many of us in our Zoom experiences have gone into breakout rooms and like, what's the question? Where do we go? What do we click on? So this became a really, really critical tool that I have implemented in my own teaching and classroom myself. On number 5, you'll see that there are some diagrams. Those diagrams were really specific to our mosquito monitoring activity, kind of helped orient them anatomically so that they knew how to identify species. And again, it was one of the most frequently used files, so we had it right there on their HyperDoc with them. And then in that kind of that third cycle, we had again another discussion group where we listened to a podcast, a Science Friday podcast, that was specifically looking at tribal impacts of COVID and how they have been disproportionately impacted, whether it's remote staff or resources or limited test kits, and some specific questions for that discussion. And then finally, they were going to have an opportunity to kind of, what are they thinking about their posters and have that opportunity for that feedback and just that socialization during that crazy time of early summer when we were going through, when we're all going through COVID. So that student guide was a really, really important communication tool. And then lastly, Jamboard. So Jamboard is another Google activity. And I have one final link that I want to share with you. But I'm going to share with you this Jamboard because I want you to just click on it and just kind of click around, just, play with it. But this is an interactive whiteboard where you can post sticky notes. So we had like the discussion questions kind of preloaded on a board. And then when, students went to the board, they could just put a little sticky note with their answer. And then you could kind of use those to organize thoughts and, okay, these are kind of similar ideas, or, this is an interesting idea. And you can simultaneously interact with one another, across that digital divide. And if you go look at that Jamboard, I think there's a maximum of 30 people at one time. So if you go to click on that Jamboard and you're not able to get to it, it may be maximized for how many people can access it. But I use Jamboard quite a bit in my virtual teaching. But you'll see on board 2 of that link that I sent, you can change the background to where it is like a graph paper or even a dot matrix, and you can draw on it. So, whether you're discussing a graph or you have, some math that you want to be working on, or you want to play Pictionary, it's a good kind of platform to help facilitate that interaction between groups. But we use Jamboard both for our cultural discussion with our storytelling in the beginning of the workshop, and then we wrapped up with our Science Friday podcast discussion at the end. So Jamboard was a really important communication tool. And then finally, here's some examples of the posters that students came up with during STEAM Camp. And again, this was on Padlet. So Padlet is it kind of reminds me of like Pinterest or something. It's a digital kind of bulletin board, but students can post pictures, you can post comments, and we used it really as a way for students to post their posters, and then we could look at them and then judge them for the challenge. And something that I thought was really awesome about these student outcomes was that, we talked about mosquitoes and vector-borne diseases, but at the end of the day, they kind of took everything we were talking about, whether it was tribal public health, storytelling, science, and they kind of made it their own. So there's a real diverse spectrum of student products when it came to their PSA posters. And then finally, I just want to share with you a little bit of April and I's collaborative work with our Native Youth Science Club. This is something that since I've begun teaching, in my adult career has been one of our highlights. But here at Norman Public Schools, we sponsor a science club for students in grades 2nd all the way through 12th grade. So that sets up this incredible opportunity to where, we have high school, middle, and elementary kids, and we're able to set up, mentoring programs and really span the ages that we're able to work with. And the focus of our club is environmental science and science education through Native American cultural experiences. So the pictures you see on your screen here, down in the bottom left, that was our first Three Sisters garden that was funded through NOAA Planet Stewards. The name of our project was Cultivating Community, but that was our first project with Native Youth Science Club. Right next to that, you see students are working on a paper mache, and it's really a 4-foot by 4-foot paper mache turtle. And that is kind of come from, his name is Loxi, which is the Chickasaw word for turtle. But, earth on a turtle's back is a common story among many different tribes. And we've really centered that idea and made a giant paper mache turtle that eventually is going to be kind of a diorama, I guess you could say, that reflects our local ecosystem and, kind of has the Canadian River and the different flora and fauna that you'll find around here. But again, it's bringing in that art and that cultural component, but it's focusing in on elevating science communication and helping with that science education. In the upper left-hand corner, we had an opportunity to go visit the National Weather Center and see, the really cool storm chasing vehicles they have and the neat science that they have going on at the National Weather Center. And then in the upper right-hand corner, Citizen Potawatomi Nation here in Shawnee has an eagle aviary that we were able to visit, and that was a big highlight. Everybody really enjoyed that. They have a golden eagle that you see there in the picture. And when we went to take a group picture, he really expanded his wingspan, and it's just like you can tell nobody's even looking at the camera because we're just so in awe of this eagle. And then back behind the fence that you see there, they had several other bald eagles and other species of eagle. That was a really great experience that we were able to take our kiddos on and have, this environmental science education experience through this Native American kind of cultural lens. And that's all I have for you guys. On our Jamboard that I shared the link to earlier, I asked if you guys had any questions or if you kind of want to interact with those little sticky notes. You can leave a question for us there, but I'll also turn this back over and open up the floor to answer any questions. And thank you so much for having us. It was really great to share with you guys this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Amelia. And April. Okay, I invite everyone to come back in to gallery view mode and put your cameras on if you'd like. I know I would like to see you. And we have time for a discussion and thoughts and ideas and feelings and questions and comments and whatever comes up. So please do unmute yourselves.
Halito, I'll ask a question. I am so happy to see or hear about this because I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation. And so I'm very thankful to hear that you were there and in Oklahoma. And I just love hearing about all of this. I'm in Oklahoma State, by the way, but I'm from Tulsa. So yay for Broken Arrow. I went to high school there. I first want to make a comment that I really got a lot out of how you presented like the structure of how you did things. That's incredibly helpful as we're thinking about at Oklahoma State, how we have some initiatives we're working on. And I love the incorporation of Jamboard. That's just amazing. I can totally see students really enjoying that. So thanks very much for all the ideas. I have a question. I was hoping you could tell us just a little bit more in terms of kind of background, like before getting some of these things in place, how you looked into like tying in the scientific piece with the cultural piece and having that be individualized for different nations.
So that is my ultimate challenge. I mean, really, my bachelor's degree was from OSU, and I studied biological sciences and then went to got my master's degree in science ed. And as I was finishing up my degree at OU, I interned with April and learned about these wonderful opportunities for tribal outreach. And it kind of, ignited this whole world of curiosity for me, and just and subsequently that I'm looking to finish my PhD program studying just this. So, what different stories are there? What is that, kind of that perennial philosophy? What is that continuity? What is, what is consistent with symbology, and how can we use that to communicate and also, harness that for science education? Part of our NGSS standards, so the Next Generation Science Standards, storylining is a new instructional method to where you kind of give like this narrative vehicle for students to put context to learning. And in my science classroom, when we have a new topic, we talk a lot about like science history and how this was discovered. But utilizing Native American culture and the, not just the meat of it, but the delivery and how storytelling kind of unites us all, and as a way of passing on knowledge through oral histories. So that is the question. Like it's always a kind of a research project. Every time we start something new, I always start with the science. What's the science outcome that we want, especially with our club? So when we went to like the National Weather Center, we were looking at like climate versus weather, and then I would go and use that to figure out, well, what kind of story aligns with that. So I would start with the science and then find the story to introduce the idea and use that kind of as my bridge into the science lesson.
I would say for me, so I work with tribal professionals, and so finding those careers, right? And that's the scientists that work for the tribe, and showing that you can do this for your tribe, that there are staff doing STEM and science and things like that. So the career pathways, and bringing in, a tribal epidemiologist or somebody that works in that for a tribe or here in these communities is really, and so I think it was really interesting to see Amelia and I work together in that way, as she, she's an educator and I was doing a lot of informal education in tribal communities, but that partnership has been really good for us, and bringing in, different speakers and different scientists and different experts in my network to assist Amelia in doing those things that she talked about.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would love to follow up with both of you. I don't want to monopolize the time here. So April, I saw you put your email in the chat, so I'll communicate with you all. Yakoki, thank you so much.
Wonderful.
There was a question in the chat about having challenges with students with adequate technology access. That's always a challenge. With the STEAM camp that we presented on today, Jones Academy provided their students with devices. And so, that was kind of already taken care of for us. But honestly, devices, bandwidth, that's always an issue. But it's also another reason why I really promote that idea of that HyperDoc, that student guide, because even if kids were kind of having, intermittent connectivity issues, they still knew where we were and what we were doing. And if they couldn't connect on Zoom, they could jump in with us on the Jamboard or, on our dock or something. But technology is always, sometimes it's an amazing thing, and then sometimes it cuts you at your knees.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really interested in whether either of you sort of got into more holistic pictures of the ecosystems of which mosquitoes are a central component. Our experience with both tick and mosquito work is that they become, the evil vector creature, and yet they are, a critical food source for key species. And I just wondered if either of you had played around with that at all.
So I will say one aspect that comes to mind is when we do NICALC. So NICALC is, these Native youth from all across the country and very different cultures. But one of the things that comes to mind with that is, some Native communities have words for things that they have never experienced, or have. And so mosquito is one of those things, right? Or a tick, they may have never seen it or experienced it, but they have a cultural connection to that. A cactus is another one that they may not have cactus in their jurisdiction or where they're at, but they have words for those things. And so those cultural sort of meanings of things that, that are more holistic, that these things exist. But one of the things that comes to mind when we talk about NICALC is we learned a lot about mosquitoes and ticks and youth that have never had those things or seen those things that we're bringing into West Virginia, right in the middle of July, and the humidity and everything else that's there, and they're so in a different environment. But one thing that we did there that we brought in a traditional or a Native health professional as our nurse or staff on hand, because, so we learned a lot about, how different cultures perceive like DEET or spray or removal of these things. And so every year, I hear something different of, culturally of how they, is it mustard seed in New Mexico that they put on their bites, or, all these things. And it's a huge learning curve between the cultures, but there's a lot of sharing as well in that holistic understanding of our world and place. And so that's one experience from that. But I think, working with tribes, that's something that I continue to learn more and more of, how that is, that perception, that it is more holistic, that you can't separate things out into, different silos or different sectors, different departments, and things like that. And so seeing that and that sort of cycle come back to who are we as people is always a big theme for us.
Can I jump in with a question? This is Daniela. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about the cultural knowledge and information that you shared, and not necessarily the depths of the story, but how you came to have that in your hands, and did you work with elders and community, and did they put this forward for the youth, into your hands to share with the youth, and then was Globe Mosquito Mapper, did that come into being as, oh, well, let's pair that with this story? You talked about, putting the cultural knowledge first in the, I don't know if it was daily, but in the sort of learning sequence, so how did the story kind of come to play? And again, was Globe brought to the story, or the other way around, or what was the relationship between the two in your process of developing the camp? And I have a follow-on question, so I'll wait for that. Thank you.
So that is really That was the initial challenge. We knew we wanted to do mosquito monitoring because that we could make that hands-on. We could send that to students, and then, like I said, we started with the science and then went back from there. And we knew we were going to use this tribal public health perspective, and so that kind of led me just to research. Really, I wish I had more. I wish I had more sharing opportunities with elders. And it, kind of as a side note, one of the amazing things about working with April is when you're at one of these workshops, you'll strike up a conversation with an elder and they'll just give you a little story that, like one that stuck with me is a gentleman explained to me how they would take pumpkin and when they harvest it, they would cut it very thinly and they would weave it into a mat and dry it out in the sun so that you would have just this nice little portable, flat, preserved pumpkin that you could just throw into a pot of soup. That's always stuck with me. And that's just like that kind of opportunity is why I'm so excited and interested to do this more, because you never know when those stories are going to come or how when that sharing is going to occur. So specifically for mosquito monitoring, we knew we wanted to do that. We knew we wanted to bring in the medicine side of it, which led me to specifically the bull and cedar tree story, because it was about living in balance with nature and the give and take and kind of what that circle of life meant in terms of medicine and how our environment provides for us what we need. So I started with the science, knew where we wanted to go, and that kind of led me to the story. But really, it's just a lot of research.
Okay, if I could ask my follow-on question then. So these two things came together under the, within the context of tribal public health, it sounds like that was the glue, perhaps. What exactly does that mean? And how did the kids, what connections did they make in that context? I heard, I'm not going to get it right, but I recall you said at one point that, no, I'm not going to get it right, but that they were working to make connections between these two things, and the cultural knowledge was sort of uplifting, and I'm not sure what you said, but the science, I'd love to hear more about the connection making.
I was just going to share that. So one of our students, Jacob Nichols, that I mentioned on my piece for the tribal health training, was the one who led this activity at the Jones Academy. So it was a peer-to-peer learning. And one of the cool things that we heard back within a few months even is that, so Jacob introduced all of our junior faculty, our Native college students introduced themselves and talked, and engaged with the students in the different breakouts and things like that. And Jacob introduced himself as a biomedical engineering student here at OU. Well, we heard back a few months later that one of the students had successfully applied and gotten into a biomedical program, I believe at Harvard, one of the Ivy League schools. And so that inspiration and her choice of, that into a health field and what health field that she was interested in was really inspiring to hear. And so, at the Jones Academy, this STEAM camp is at a really critical age where they are making those decisions and learning about, potential careers or degrees and pathways and things like that. And so I think that's one way, but tribal public health is, something that with Indian Health Service, and many of the tribes have tribal health departments and significant capacity in these areas. But it's really interesting when you have the cultural components, right? And the staff that work with, whether it's diabetes and traditional foods or different avenues that they include their culture and their traditional ways or ways of knowing things and understanding those sort of cultural aspects of and contributions to and way health is viewed as a holistic well-being in that, and that and the training of some of those professionals as well. Amelia, did you want to comment on that question about?
Well, specifically for the STEAM camp, Jones Academy, they do a different theme every summer. And this summer, before COVID, they were doing medical. There was going to be medical focused and, medical careers. And then, of course, with it being STEAM camp, they were they really wanted to emphasize that art component. So really it was just a natural product of those different things that we knew we needed to have, like a medical focus. We're in a time of COVID. I know there's kind of that two different camps, do we give kids a break from it, or do we make it a relevant and real learning opportunity? So we kind of took advantage of both of those worlds to kind of put a perspective on why we should focus on tribal public health and why it's important to communicate through that tribal cultural perspective. So for this example, it was kind of set up for us because that was what the camp requested.
All right. Carolyn, your square has lit up. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say hi and to April and and thank you for talking about NICALC and the connections made there. That event, I feel the same way you do. It's just such an inspiring event, and it's led to many different circles and connections. So it was a pleasure to see you present today on your work and where this is all led. And I think, I don't know if Lynn is still on. I think she is. Lynn Chambers from NASA. She was so gracious back when I wanted to bring a NASA workshop to NICALC. And we did it the first Globe Citizen Science Workshop a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. So just the full circle. It's lovely to see that. And thank you to Daniela to having them present today. It's lovely to see.
Yeah, lots of circles coming into a connection today. So it's wonderful to hold space for that. Right on. Unless there's anything else bubbling up for people, I think we can go ahead and wrap up there. I'm going to join everyone in the chat. I hope, Amelia and April, you're seeing this, and lots of gratitude and appreciation for you sharing your experience and knowledge and wisdom with us. Thank you. I think we all learned a lot. Look forward to hearing more from the camps in the future.